In the sweltering Nevada desert of 1925, a lonely crossroads stretched under a merciless sun, where dusty trails met like silent conspirators. Travelers came seeking passage, water, or fortune and vanished without a trace. Horse-drawn wagons were found abandoned, belongings scattered like breadcrumbs and cryptic messages scratched into rock faces. Locals whispered of a curse or perhaps a calculated predator, moving unseen among the sand dunes. For some, the desert swallowed them whole. For others, it left only haunting echoes. What truly happened at this crossroads remains a riddle, a shadowed chapter in the lawless heart of the American West. The Nevada desert in 1925 was a vast expanse of unforgiving heat, jagged rocks and endless sand, a place where survival depended on preparation, instinct, and a measure of luck. The crossroads that sat at the heart of this desolate landscape were more than a mere intersection of trails. They were a lifeline for travelers moving between mining towns, rail stops, and scattered settlements. Water was scarce, shade non-existent, and the sun beat down mercilessly from dawn to dusk, turning the horizon into a mirage of shimmering heat. Those who ventured into these arid wastes quickly realized that the desert could be as lethal as any outlaw or predator. The crossroads itself, though seemingly unremarkable to the casual eye, held a reputation among locals as a place where fortunes were lost, directions were confused, and people disappeared without warning. Dusty tracks crisscrossed the sand, marking the passage of wagons, horses, and the occasional lone rider. Each trail told a story, some of hopeful miners seeking silver and gold, others of weary families moving westward, and still others of drifters who had nowhere else to go. Yet the convergence of these routes at a single exposed point created a strange sort of vulnerability. Travelers were easy to spot, their movements predictable, their need for resources obvious to anyone or anything watching. The isolation of the crossroads amplified danger. With no nearby settlements, communication was slow and aid often days away. A lost wagon wheel, a broken axle, or even a simple miscalculation in direction could quickly turn a routine journey into a nightmare. The desert had a way of magnifying every small misstep, making it nearly impossible to remain unseen. Yet paradoxically, people vanished as if swallowed whole, leaving behind only footprints that dissolved with the wind. Local guides and ranchers knew the crossroads well, and their warnings were both practical and superstitious. They spoke of sudden sandstorms that appeared without warning, erasing tracks in minutes, and of shadows that seemed to move independently across the dunes. Some described feeling an invisible presence, a weight in the air that suggested someone or something was watching. Travelers often reported seeing figures on the horizon, appearing just long enough to wave or speak, only to vanish when approached. The crossroads was a place where the familiar rules of the world seemed suspended. Distances were distorted, temperatures fluctuated with alarming speed, and even the animals that roamed the desert acted unpredictably. Horses would spook without reason, and dogs accompanying travelers sometimes refused to cross certain stretches of sand. Growling at invisible threats, despite its danger, the crossroads remained a necessary passage. Mining towns were booming, and the rails and trails offered the only viable routes for commerce and communication. Those who knew the desert and respected its power could navigate the terrain, marking wells, natural springs, and shaded alcoves along the way. But even seasoned travelers had to exercise extreme caution. Supplies were rationed, paths memorized, and every interaction with strangers carefully scrutinized. For those unprepared or overconfident, the crossroads offered no mercy, and the desert claimed its toll in silence, leaving stories behind only in hushed warnings and missing persons reports that would grow into local legend. Eyewitness accounts of the travelers who vanished at the Nevada desert crossroads in 1925 form a chilling mosaic of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. Locals who frequented the area remembered countless occasions when strangers passed through, often weary and wary, only to disappear without explanation. Some witnesses described seeing families setting out in wagons, children clutching ragged dolls, their faces flushed with the desert sun, waving to anyone who offered a friendly nod. A day or two later, those same travelers would be gone, leaving behind scattered belongings, a tin cup, a bundle of clothes, a partially eaten loaf of bread, abandoned as though the people themselves had evaporated into thin air. The accounts often shared a haunting consistency. Travelers were last seen interacting with strangers whose motives seemed innocuous at first glance. A prospector named Elias Hargrove recalled helping a young couple repair a broken wheel, sharing water and a brief conversation under the scorching sun. He looked away for only a moment, returning to find them gone, their wagon empty and horses wandering aimlessly. Another witness, Clara Morton, reported seeing a lone rider approach a family of miners, exchanging a few words and then riding off. When search parties later arrived, there was no trace of the travelers, yet the rider's tracks led only as far as the horizon before vanishing. These accounts, repeated in hushed tones around campfires and tavern tables, created a growing unease, a shared sense that the desert itself, or something within it, was orchestrating these disappearances. Some witnesses were more specific, offering unsettling details that defied ordinary explanation. A stagecoach driver, William Trask, claimed he saw a man in a dark coat standing at the crossroads, smiling politely at every passing wagon, then vanishing entirely when approached. "It was like he stepped into the sun and melted," Trask told a local newspaper, though skeptics dismissed him as fanciful. Others reported seeing faint, flickering shadows along the dunes, figures that moved with impossible speed, sometimes mimicking travelers' movements from afar. When a group of laborers tried to follow these shadows, the shapes would vanish into the wind, leaving only the echoes of hurried footsteps. These mysterious appearances fed the imagination, creating a folklore of cautionary encounters that combined both human and possibly supernatural elements. Eyewitnesses also described the psychological toll the crossroads took on those who lingered too long. Travelers spoke of a sudden, oppressive silence that would descend with the setting sun, punctuated by the faint whistle of the wind that sounded almost like voices calling names. Some claimed to feel invisible eyes on them, a prickling awareness that they were being watched. Horses would grow restless, refusing to advance, and even seasoned guides reported disorientation, unable to judge distances or direction correctly. Many travelers recounted the strange behavior of other desert wanderers, smiles that seemed rehearsed, greetings that vanished into whispers, or advice that led them deeper into barren stretches of sand. The cumulative weight of these eyewitness accounts painted a terrifying picture. The Desert Crossroads was a place where ordinary rules of safety and human behavior seemed suspended. Those who passed through did so under the constant threat of disappearance, not as an accident of nature but as part of a pattern, observed yet unfathomable, that would remain etched into the memories of those who survived the encounter. The Desert Crossroads in Nevada was littered with the remnants of vanished travelers, their abandoned possessions telling fragmented stories of sudden disappearance and unexplained peril. Wagons sat stranded in the sand, wheels half buried, harnesses slack, as though the drivers had simply stepped away and never returned. Personal belongings were scattered nearby, worn leather satchels, journals opened to pages of hastily scribbled entries, tin cups, blankets, and even jewelry left untouched in the dust. Some items were positioned with eerie care, as if placed deliberately, while others were tossed chaotically, suggesting a sudden and violent interruption. The desert in its merciless expanse seemed to swallow these artifacts, leaving clues that were both tantalizing and maddeningly incomplete. Scattered around these abandoned possessions were often odd symbols or cryptic messages, carved into rocks or etched into the wooden planks of wagons. Some depicted unfamiliar geometric shapes, while others bore simple, haunting words: "He waits," "Turn back," or initials whose owners were never identified. Locals speculated endlessly about these markings. Were they warnings left by previous travelers, desperate to caution those who followed? Or were they the signatures of some calculating predator, leaving a calling card to taunt authorities or thrill in the terror inflicted? The ambiguity of these clues created an unsettling tension, blurring the line between natural misfortune and deliberate malice. The arrangement and condition of abandoned items often deepened the mystery. Some wagons appeared to have been in the midst of repair, tools scattered on the sand, yet the driver and horses had vanished. Other scenes seemed ritualistic: a bundle of clothing folded neatly beside a lone boot, a journal opened to a page mid-sentence, its ink smudged by wind and dust. Each discovery provoked questions without answers, hinting at either an unseen force guiding the desert's hand or a predator moving with patience and precision. Even experienced prospectors and guides, hardened to the desert's challenges, described feeling unease when encountering such sights, as if the atmosphere itself warned them of danger. Occasionally, belongings of vanished travelers were found far from the crossroads, sometimes miles away, lying untouched in the sand or hanging from twisted mesquite trees. This dislocation of items added another layer of mystery. Footprints suggested movement, but no trace of the people who had carried these possessions remained. Horses often returned to nearby ranches alone, saddles empty, as if the desert had claimed the humans while sparing the animals. Investigators cataloged these artifacts meticulously, hoping patterns would emerge, yet each piece only deepened the enigma. Eyewitness accounts frequently reference the disorienting effect of encountering these abandoned scenes. Travelers would come upon a lone hat in the sand, or a scattered bundle of belongings and experience a creeping sense of dread, as if the desert were deliberately manipulating perception. Even mundane items, dropped cups, a torn jacket, assumed sinister significance when encountered in isolation, fueling stories of disappearing strangers and predatory figures. Over time, these recurring findings created an unspoken rule among locals. Approach the crossroads with caution, never linger, and always travel with companions, for the desert's scattered artifacts were reminders that disappearance was never far behind. Among the locals of Nevada in 1925, stories of the desert crossroads were whispered in equal parts fear and fascination, and the tales that emerged blurred the line between superstition and grim reality. Miners, ranchers, and itinerant travelers all contributed fragments of observation, painting a picture of a place where human understanding faltered and imagination thrived. Some spoke of a lurking predator, a man or perhaps a group who studied the trails and preyed on the weary. Others offered darker explanations, invoking spirits or curses born of the land itself, as if the desert had a consciousness that punished the careless or the curious. The repeated disappearances of travelers lent credibility to these tales, and over time, legend merged seamlessly with fact. Eyewitnesses frequently reported encounters with strangers whose behavior was unnervingly precise, almost rehearsed. They appeared at just the right moment, offering guidance, directions, or assistance, only to vanish when approached too closely. In one account, a miner named Henry Talbot described helping a man with a broken wagon axle, only for the man to dal, smile, nod, and step into the shimmering heat haze, leaving no trace behind. These fleeting interactions fed suspicions of a predator who knew the terrain intimately, exploiting isolation and human vulnerability. Stories of such figures spread quickly among desert communities, often accompanied by the advice to trust no one, not even those who seemed most helpful. Superstition wove itself into these accounts as well. Many locals believed the desert was home to restless spirits, guardians of the land who punished those who wandered too far or trespassed at the wrong time. Carved symbols on rocks were interpreted as warnings from those who had vanished or messages from unseen entities marking the passage of victims. Campfire tales spoke of voices carried on the wind, calling names or repeating fragments of travelers' last words. Even the seasoned prospector Samuel Riggs admitted to feeling a weight in the air while crossing the dunes, a sensation that made the hairs on his neck rise, and he had spent decades navigating the desert's harshest regions. The desert's isolation amplified fear, creating a psychological tension that often rivaled the physical danger. Travelers reported an unshakable sense of being watched, shadows that seemed to shift with intent, and the disorienting effects of heat and sand on perception. Horses would refuse to advance. Companions would suddenly become anxious or agitated, and compasses seemed unreliable, as if the desert itself resisted mapping. These phenomena reinforced the locals' belief that some invisible force was orchestrating events, whether human or supernatural, making the crossroads a place where caution was not merely prudent but essential for survival. Rumors and legends grew alongside the disappearances. Some suggested that an organized criminal operation preyed on the desert's isolation, deliberately luring travelers into traps. Others whispered of darker occult influences, claiming that those who vanished had unknowingly trespassed into sacred or cursed territory. While no conclusive evidence ever emerged, the combination of repeated disappearances, cryptic messages, and eerie eyewitness reports cemented the crossroads in local consciousness as a place of dread. These tales were shared in taverns and boarding houses, passed down to new arrivals, forming a collective understanding that the desert demanded respect and vigilance, and that the consequences of negligence could be permanent and unexplained. The patterns of disappearance at the Nevada Desert Crossroads suggested a chilling intentionality, a calculated orchestration that defied the randomness of mere misfortune. Observers began to notice that the vanishings were rarely coincidental. They followed a sequence that hinted at careful observation and perhaps premeditation. Travelers were often last seen in predictable moments of vulnerability, repairing a broken wheel, searching for water, or resting in the shade of a lone rock formation. In nearly every case, someone, or something, appeared to be watching, waiting, for the precise moment to strike, leaving no evidence of struggle or forced entry. The consistency of these occurrences made it impossible for locals to dismiss them as accidents, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Investigators and witnesses noted that the disappearances rarely involved overt violence. Wagons remained intact, supplies were left behind, and horses often returned to familiar routes unaccompanied. This absence of physical struggle suggested that the people were either abducted with extreme skill or lured into the desert by deception, vanishing before anyone could intervene. In one striking example, a family of 3 was last seen accepting directions from a well-dressed stranger who promised a shortcut to a nearby settlement. Days later, their wagon appeared abandoned at the edge of the dunes, the sand showing no signs of human footprints leading away. The implication was unsettling. Someone had manipulated the environment or the travelers themselves, moving them out of sight without leaving the usual traces that would indicate panic or struggle. Patterns extended to the timing and environmental conditions surrounding disappearances. Many incidents occurred during the heat of midday, when the desert sun could distort perception, or during sudden sandstorms that erased tracks in minutes. Witnesses consistently reported a disorienting haze on the horizon, strange mirages and fleeting shadows that seemed to follow travelers for miles. These natural factors, combined with the seemingly intentional positioning of abandoned belongings, suggested that the desert itself, or at least those who understood it intimately, was being used as a tool to facilitate disappearances. The coordination of these elements indicated a level of sophistication that went beyond chance, making even experienced desert guides wary. Eyewitness accounts reinforced this sense of premeditation. Individuals who survived near-miss encounters described strangers offering assistance or advice at critical moments, only for the travelers to later vanish when alone. It was as if these figures were studying their targets, learning routines and weaknesses, then exploiting them with precision. Locals began to recognize recurring motifs: abandoned wagons at specific vantage points, personal items left in deliberate arrangements, and signs or messages that could be interpreted as warnings or markers. These patterns suggested that whoever, or whatever was responsible, had a deep understanding of human behavior, psychology, and the harsh desert environment. Over time, these repeated occurrences created an informal map in the minds of locals, a recognition of areas where disappearances clustered, routes where travelers were most vulnerable, and moments when intervention was least likely. Patterns in clothing, the type of wagons, or the composition of traveling parties were noted, as if a meticulous observer were cataloging potential targets. The premeditation implied in these disappearances made the crossroads a place of dread, transforming it from a necessary passage into a psychological minefield. Those who ventured through the desert began to adopt extreme caution, carrying redundant supplies, traveling in groups, and avoiding any engagement with strangers. Yet the mystery persisted, with new vanishings reinforcing the notion that some unseen force or cunning individual was orchestrating events with unnerving consistency. Local authorities in Nevada during the mid-1920s faced immense challenges when trying to investigate the disappearances at the Desert Crossroads, their efforts hampered by both the vastness of the terrain and the elusive nature of the events themselves. Law enforcement was minimal in these remote regions. Sheriffs often had only a handful of deputies and relied heavily on local ranchers, prospectors, and guides to report incidents or track missing travelers. When a disappearance was reported, authorities would organize search parties combing miles of sand, scrub, and rocky outcrops. Despite their diligence, these searches frequently yielded nothing. Wagons were found abandoned, possessions scattered, but the individuals themselves remained completely missing, leaving investigators frustrated and increasingly unnerved by the seeming impossibility of the case. Reports from these early investigations reveal a consistent pattern of bafflement. Deputies often describe the desert as an adversary in its own right. Heat haze distorted distances, shifting dunes erased footprints, and sudden sandstorms could render entire search areas impassable. Horses trained to track scents would become confused, either refusing to advance or circling endlessly. Investigators noted that many disappearance sites had a peculiar stillness, a silence that seemed almost purposeful, as if the desert itself conspired against the search efforts. Maps were marked with clusters of vanishings, yet no discernible route or direction of movement could be established. Every attempt to impose order on the chaos of the desert seemed to fail, leaving the authorities to rely on eyewitness accounts, which were often inconsistent or tinged with superstition. The lack of physical evidence compounded the difficulty. Deputies frequently encountered abandoned personal items, bags, clothing, journals, and tools, but no signs of struggle or footprints leading away from these objects. Horses were sometimes found wandering alone, saddles in place, suggesting that whatever had taken the travelers had done so with extraordinary skill or stealth. Investigators grew increasingly convinced that the desert's geography was being exploited by someone who understood it intimately. Reports mention shadows seen on the dunes, figures glimpsed from a distance, and fleeting appearances of strangers offering aid, all disappearing when approached. Yet despite repeated sightings, no culprit was ever apprehended, leaving only a growing ledger of unexplained disappearances. Communication and resources further limited the authorities' effectiveness. Many of the towns surrounding the crossroads were small, isolated, and lacked telegraph lines or regular postal service, slowing the transmission of information. Deputies had to rely on riders and couriers, often taking days to reach neighboring towns. By the time reinforcements arrived, the desert had already erased vital evidence. The remoteness also discouraged thorough investigations. Authorities were wary of spending weeks searching vast stretches of sand and rock with little hope of success, particularly when their own lives and horses were at risk from exposure, dehydration, or disorientation. Even when investigations yielded clues, they were cryptic at best. Etched symbols on rocks, partial journals, and scattered belongings provided tantalizing hints but no actionable leads. Lawmen often had to contend with a mix of superstition, rumor, and fear among locals, making it difficult to separate fact from folklore. Witnesses who claimed to see mysterious figures or shadowy presences were met with skepticism, yet the consistency of these reports could not be ignored. Over time, it became clear that the Desert Crossroads presented challenges beyond mere criminal investigation, demanding an understanding of the environment, human psychology, and perhaps even the inexplicable, as conventional methods seemed almost entirely inadequate against the mysteries that unfolded there. The enduring mystery of the Nevada Desert Crossroads left a profound mark on local culture and collective memory, shaping the way travelers, settlers, and ranchers approached the region for decades. Even after the peak of disappearances in the mid-1920s, the stories persisted, passed down in whispered warnings, campfire tales, and newspaper reports that blended fact with speculation. Locals developed a deep respect, often bordering on fear, for the crossroads, treating it as a place not to be taken lightly. Maps and travel guides began marking the area with cautionary notes, advising outsiders to avoid lingering, to travel in groups, and to maintain vigilance for strangers whose motives were impossible to discern. The desert had become a teacher, imparting lessons in survival, skepticism, and the need for constant awareness. The disappearances also influenced the behavior of travelers in highly specific ways. Families and prospectors learned to ration supplies meticulously, always carrying extra water and food, and planning routes to avoid isolation. Horses were tethered strategically, wagons were kept close together, and campfires were lit only sparingly to avoid drawing attention. Those who ventured near the crossroads were often hyper-aware of their surroundings, scanning dunes and ridges for movement, scrutinizing strangers with suspicion, and marking trails to prevent getting lost. The psychological impact was profound. Even a brief pause at the crossroads could instill a creeping sense of dread, a heightened awareness of mortality in a landscape that seemed indifferent, if not actively hostile, to human life. Folklore around the crossroads grew into a distinct cultural phenomenon. Stories circulated of spectral figures, unseen watchers, and travelers who returned forever changed, hardened, haunted, or silently refusing to speak of what they had seen. The cryptic messages etched into rocks, the abandoned belongings, and the horses returning alone became symbols in local lore, cautionary elements that served both as warnings and as narrative threads connecting generations of desert travelers. Schools, inns, and saloons became informal repositories of these tales, with old-timers recounting them to newcomers as lessons in respect for both the land and the unknown forces, human or otherwise, that might inhabit. Yet the crossroads also left a tangible imprint on law enforcement, mining operations, and ranching practices. Authorities became more systematic in tracking disappearances, developing rudimentary databases of missing travelers, their last known locations, and the circumstances of their vanishings. Guides and prospectors shared knowledge openly, mapping out safe passages in risky areas, and creating an informal network of vigilance that extended across the desert. Some families, traumatized by disappearances of friends or relatives, refused to send members through the crossroads at all, rerouting travel and trade to less isolated paths. In essence, the desert's history of vanishings created a culture of hyper-awareness and community cooperation, born out of necessity. Even decades later, the crossroads remained a symbol of mystery and caution. Tourists and historians retracing old routes reported the same eerie silence, the same sense of being observed, and the scattered remnants of human presence that seemed to defy explanation. Local lore treated the crossroads not merely as a physical location, but as a psychological landmark, an emblem of the desert's capacity to consume, confuse, and confound. Its influence extended beyond simple superstition. It informed practical behavior, shaped storytelling traditions, and maintained a persistent aura of danger and intrigue that ensured the lessons of 1925 remained alive, ingrained in the desert's living memory. As the sun sets over the desolate Nevada crossroads, and the wind whispers across dunes that have swallowed countless travelers, one question lingers. What truly happened to those who vanished into the desert's unforgiving embrace? Could it have been human malice, a predator moving unseen among the sand, or something older than memory itself, hiding in the endless expanse? As you sit with that uncertainty, imagine standing there yourself, the heat pressing down, the horizon shimmering, shadows that may or may not be alive. What would you do? Who could you trust? If the echoes of this dark tale unsettled you, if the thought of vanished travelers haunts your imagination, then step further into the shadows with us. Subscribe now and join a community that seeks the untold, the hidden, the chilling truths history tries to forget. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done at that crossroads? Could you have survived the desert? Or would you have become another story whispered by wind and sand? Every disappearance has a story, and the desert keeps many. Hit subscribe, leave your reflection below, and prepare for the next journey into history's darkest corners, where mysteries refuse to die.